Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Big, very much for the invitation to come speak here today. So Mobility as a Service, MaaS, it's a very topical conference theme, I think, and a subject of a new research focus for us at the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies, ITLS. We have a new interest in transport and logistics in the digital era, and closely aligned, I think, with the agenda of the bus industry. And of course, we work closely with through Bus New South Wales and also you guys in BIG as well. So looking to the future, futures in bus contracts, business models, and MaaS. And before I get there, I want to start by looking at some broader thinking in terms of new futures in urban passenger transport, what this effect might have on the urban realm, and also introduce MaaS as an emerging concept. And some of this might have been covered this morning or yesterday, so please bear with me. And then afterwards, I will present our ongoing research, which is market testing MaaS in terms of two components, demand and supply. So I want to set the scene by introducing some of the key drivers in this emerging transport paradigm for the urban setting. And I would say there's never been a more exciting time in transportation. We're at the cusp of the greatest transformation since the advent of the automobile. And this is driven by a number of key factors. Collaborative consumption, so new market entrants providing ride sourcing and microtransit. Connected and autonomous vehicles with, of course, implications for safety, productivity, traffic congestion, road capacity, and the urban form. And demographic change, this idea that the newer generation has less emotional attachment towards cars, making it more acceptable to shift from vehicle ownership to access. And all of this is underpinned by digital technologies which form the interface for connecting demanders and suppliers and for facilitating the physical delivery of transportation. And I'll discuss each of these drivers briefly. So we have global transportation network companies, TNCs, who have already disrupted the taxi industry to great fanfare, and now they want to do it to public transport. And we have evidence that shows that sometimes they compete with public transport, other times they complement public transport, and this really depends on the exact market and demographic. But the far broader aim of these TNCs, and along with some other tech players, is they want to venture into vehicle automation. And the greatest unknown in this future world is what is the future ownership model for autonomous vehicles, which will determine the number of vehicles in the system and the proportion of time that they spend out on the road. So various people have devised different ownership models. Elon Musk, for instance, suggests an own and share model where Teslas are privately owned, but then you can use them for autonomous ride sourcing when not in use. Other people, Marcus Enoch, they suggest there might be a modal convergence towards a universal automated taxi service. So a lot of sharing, but no more mass transit. So a lot of this point-to-point propositions, we are unsure how these might play out in terms of network efficiency. So there's a number of other key factors. Across the developed world, we're seeing youth licensing on the decline, and there's mixed evidence again on whether this is due to educational participation, increasing educational participation and decreasing full-time employment rates, or due to attitudinal changes in these younger generation in terms of cars no longer being a status symbol. There are issues around millennials, how they share space, and also an aging population with a greater proportion of dependents who can no longer drive. And all of these are demand push factors away from vehicle ownership towards shared mobility and mobility consumed as a service. Now, the question remains, in amongst these technologies and trends, will they make our world a better place? So I invite you to peer through the looking glass at two very different futures. One of worsening congestion and urban sprawl, and another one which is a sustainable alternative. And many of the propositions by tech giants, by various people, they ignore the fact that cities are dense urban environments where road space is a scarce commodity. And there are three potentially problematic outcomes in terms of intermediate mode development, the ride sourcing and microtransits of the world. One is, and I already mentioned, a modal convergence to an automated taxi service, this idea that there can be unlimited point-to-point transportation for everyone. And point-to-point transportation is by definition low volume, associated with sole or low occupancy vehicles, which take up more road space per passenger transporter. So there simply isn't enough road space in our dense cities. The second is microtransit displaces and replaces fixed route public transport. And this is based on microtransit offering taxi-like service at bus prices, so the Uber Hop kind of examples. And it's an uneven playing field, and it becomes an issue because it's a destructive cycle as more and more subsidies are required to support conventional public transport. And lastly, microtransit evolves into fixed route public transport, which is better, and there's signs of this through Uber Pool, for instance, taking on a more rigid form, suggested pickup locations, cash incentives for the customer to board from an arterial. But ultimately, I think to reach that sustainable objective, we can't rely on intermediate modes alone. We need a system in place to deploy the most appropriate mode. And I want to motivate this with what I call the framework of modal efficiency. So here on the vertical axis, we have spatial efficiency, and we have trains, metro, heavy rail, which are carry a lot of people versus a car, which you might, if you're lucky, you might get 1.2 passengers per vehicle. And horizontally, the temporal efficiency axis, a car which is idle about 95% of the time in your garage or on the street parked, versus a taxi, which is more efficient, plying the streets around the clock, delivering transportation for people. So on the top right-hand corner, we have our spatial and temporally efficient modes, our public transport modes, both bus and rail. The caveat is an empty bus scenario, which you might know too well. On the bottom left are your private transport, so private car and car sharing as they come online. On the bottom right, temporally efficient but not spatially efficient are these intermediate modes that are popping up, ride sourcing and microtransit. And as autonomous vehicles come online, this is where I might place them. A big problem with the deadheading with no one on board, and then also various ownership models as well being touted by various people. So we see the temporal efficiency axis directly correlates with whether a vehicle, the service is privately owned, it's peer-to-peer, or it's part of a fleet, and equally so, the spatial efficiency, whether it's sole occupancy, shared occupancy, or mass occupancy. So a big problem if we're replacing all the public transport modes with intermediate modes on the bottom right. And some people seem to think that car sharing might be a panacea for it all, but it's a big order of magnitude away from the spatially efficient public transport modes. So mobility as a service, I see, and this is a subject of a paper that we've written, is a way to bring together all the temporally efficient modes across a range of spatial efficiency, and we can deploy the most appropriate mode in the particular urban environment that is most suitable. So what must MaaS do? It has to, and we can consider this framework again, it has to integrate across those two dimensions, in space and also in time. So promoting sharing in space and in time. So bringing together these public transport and intermediate modes. So whilst intermediate modes might be very new in the West, in developed countries, certainly the non-digitally enabled paratransit type services have been around a long time in South Africa, for example, in South America, parts of Asia as well. And so whilst I know there are safety issues, Stephen, with minibus taxis, but they also do some things well, which I think perhaps we can draw a lesson to. And there are instances in the South African context, for instance, where I had the great pleasure of undertaking a study visit, where minibus taxis provide an access and egress mode to bus rapid transit. And equally so temporally as well, because public transport temporal efficiency is dependent very much on the peak to base ratio. The sharper the peak, the more vehicles and staff that you procure, that you hire, that lay idle most of the time. So we can use perhaps public transport to serve the base and supplement with intermediate modes, ride sourcing and microtransit. And in the Cape Town case, when they do this on a corridor, they can save 40% in vehicle requirements through that. So MaaS is a regulatory and pricing opportunity to do that, to regulate for urban efficiency. Now, mobility as a service, we can define as a personalized one-stop travel management platform, digitally unifying trip creation, purchase, and delivery across all modes. And there's a lot of new players coming on board, MaaS Global, MaaS Alliance, MaaS Australia, who spoke yesterday. So I won't go into the details, but the design and implementation can be related to the 3 Bs. Bundles, which are mobility packages representing bundles of mobility, budgets around end-user preferences and service provision possibilities, and also brokers, new contracting models and business interests. And this forms the framework for our research at ITLS. So here are some examples of bundles where customers can purchase mobility packages. You know, you get a defined volume of access to particular modes. You can segment the market like so. But when it comes to service delivery models, there's been less work on this, and we can consider how it might play out. So firstly, the status quo. We have a government. They offer service contracts for the bus operator who delivers kilometers on the defined mode, the bus. And of course, they offer a service to the customer, the demander, in return for a fare. And this is a competitive tendering case, but it can be a government operator just the same as well. So in the MaaS scenario, we will have the same actors, but now there's an opportunity for a broker role. A broker, similar to the telco model, and what they do is they purchase the transport asset or capacity from the supplier, who enters into a mobility contract with the broker, and they in turn sell to the demander mobility packages, the customer purchase subscriptions. And there's a blur again, because your broker, they can be your existing bus operator if you want to enter this space, or it can be a non-mobility supplier. It can be a tech startup, a bank, a property developer who bundles transport as part of a rental agreement. It can be a transport supplier. It can be Trapeze who wants to enter this as well. And then there will be a new relationship between the government and your existing bus operators given this new mobility focus. Alternatively, we can consider a government contracting model where the government directly procures the broker. And what they can do is they can define an accessibility standard. For example, having X percentage of people given services within Y minutes for a defined period of the day. And the broker, they have the flexibility to deliver this with any mode. So moving from output to outcome-based thinking. And I think this is where the real opportunity lies, where the government can regulate for network efficiency through MaaS. The package that the broker sells, it can have an inherent input that the government decides, defined by time, defined by geography, defined by the spatial and temporal efficiency of each mode. So a way to put in road pricing, I think. Now, the major research gaps in this model, regardless of whether it's deregulated or under a contracting model, is the demander-broker interface, we call mobility packages, and also the broker-supply interface around mobility contracts. So we're interested in studying how these might look. So we want to study how demanders and suppliers, what are their preferences in relation to these things. And then we use stated choice methods to study choice. So we recently concluded on the demand side, the first side, some experiments looking at end-user demand for mobility packages. So we did this earlier this year. So this is where the respondents hailed from. We did it in Sydney through some intercept surveys, about 20 to 30 minutes, so quite comprehensive surveys each. And this is the survey we asked about their characteristics, and we used that to condition their choice responses in terms of the choice mobility packages that they select. So here's an excerpt of the choice task that we would give to the respondent. We see, that's the laser. We see there's different alternatives, which are your mobility packages, and then all of them, they have included public transport, how much car sharing there is, the advanced booking time, is it one way, is it round trip, the amount of included taxi, Uber pool, and how the credit is lost or otherwise. And we also offer for the respondent an opportunity to create your own choice. You can choose your own mobility package as well. And we do some sophisticated modeling to look at what are the outcomes from this. So just briefly, a few conclusions. Firstly, MaaS is most attractive to infrequent car users. So people in that middle box who are using cars perhaps 1 or 2 days a week. So that's the temporal efficiency issue. People are buying the car, they're using it 1 or 2 days, and it's laying idle a lot of the other time. So they're the market you probably want to target if you want to sell mobility packages. Much more popular than non-users of cars, so they're sole users of public transport, and also very frequent users of cars, people who are just reliant on cars. And on average, about 47% of people will subscribe to these MaaS plans. And we also estimate some willingness to pay for various mobility entitlements. So interesting results. An hour of car share is around $6.40. A day of unlimited public transport, a bit under $6. So significantly under the go-get price per hour, and also the Opal daily cap in terms of public transport fares. And we can use these kind of information to price MaaS packages in the future. So once we've concluded this, we can go to suppliers and see what the business community is willing to deliver with respect to mobility as a service. And this is a survey that we've been working on, and we hope to run early in the new year. And for this, our businesses won't just be mode-specific operators. So your bus operators, rail operators, TNCs, but also we will go to non-mobility suppliers, tech startups, investment banks, infrastructure operators, property developers, for instance, to see what interest they have in being part of this broker model. And our sampling frame, it's not just in Australia, but also Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, Western Europe, and the States, giving us a global perspective, but also because these are places we believe have quite similar perspectives on risk and investment as well. So that's our sampling frame. And in the survey, we ask, of course, we condition again the respondent organization's characteristics around contracts, around their experience, and around attitudes as well. So it's important to know the existing contracting regime. So people might know the Threadbow International Conference Series on competition and ownership in land passenger transport. So this was our recent 30-year conference held in Stockholm the other month. And from it comes 6 important contracting themes: market arbitration, procurement mechanism, asset ownership, contract design, risk allocation, contract management. So we ask questions around these important areas, but also in terms of MaaS awareness and familiarity. What are people's perceptions towards maybe their current certainty in contract renewal, but also towards new business opportunities as well? And we use that to condition the choice model. So, and I was programming this just yesterday because it's fresh off the press, very exciting. And this is an example of a choice task that we might ask to the respondent organization. So again, we have alternatives, which are various mobility contracts, and these are defined by attributes. So for instance, mobility offering, how much of the total revenue is coming from conventional public transport, on-demand public transport, car sharing, taxi, Uber, etc. Because we think operators' propensity to take part might vary depending on the revenue mix between modes. So Uber, for instance, might not want to invest in a broker in a contract where a lot of the revenue is coming from public transport. We also ask about government support, both in terms of in-principle support, so regulatory support, and also monetary, the financial support side for public transport, because there's a real opportunity here for government, for the regulator to reduce subsidy levels. And we look at various remuneration attributes, a return on investment, the amount of variance in that revenue, so the risk, the uncertainty as well, and also other considerations around the branding, your voting rights in the business, which came out very strongly in previous conversations I've had with bus operators. And also the mix of other players in the MaaS business. Is there another transport operator, platform provider, or financial enterprise in the mix? How does that affect people's buy-in? And then we ask, of course, the important one is how much you're contributing as a business into this MaaS contract, broker model. So the scale of the investment, which we condition as well, and then people can choose to participate in various forms. They can invest, in which case they're just a financial shareholder without contributing assets. Or they can supply. They can contribute their assets, vehicles, properties, infrastructure, and personnel into the MaaS business as well. So we're doing some pilots now, and hopefully we will run this early in the new year. And all of this, combined with the demand model, will help us determine a market-led equilibrium, which we can then go to government, we can go to NEIL, the regulator, and we can ask if they think it's acceptable, and then they can add an institutional overlay consistent with the urban efficiency goals of cities where necessary. So a quick summary of various themes I've touched on today. The core innovation at ITLS in this MaaS research is the interface between demanders, brokers, and suppliers. No other research body is working on this as far as we're aware. So we know already there's a lot of enthusiasm over the technology, but a lot of lack of clarity in terms of the behavior impact. And we need to ensure that digital disruption occurs to our advantage. And that's why we're here market testing mobility as a service on demanders and suppliers. And so the 2 key takeaways, one is the mobility packages, which we've been designing, and also mobility contracts in terms of us envisioning how they might look in the future. So the MaaS, and I'm finishing now, the public transport research team at ITLS working on MaaS, David Henshaw, our director, he usually comes to these bus conferences, but not this year. Corinne Mully, our chair in public transport, and also a colleague, Chin, as well. And then here are some publications of interest if you want to, some light reading on anything I've discussed today. Most of it has been published or will be in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yale. As you can see, quite a bit of work being done in this sphere locally in Australia, which is great to see. Would anybody like to ask Yale a question about his presentation? One hand up over there. Dr. Lowe.
Thanks, Yale. On what basis do you expect the whole price bundling hypothesis to proceed? Like you're crystal ball gazing and saying, we think the future of MaaS lies in these products where you pay X $100 a month or a year to a transport provider and they organise the lot for you, whether or not you use it or not. What's the theory underpinning that? Because we have a different view.
Sorry, can I ask you're from?
Yale.
This is my first.
We're in Stockholm together a couple of weeks ago.
Oh,
I'm Chris Lowe. I run the Bus Association Victoria.
of course.
Yeah,
of course. Yes, we had this discussion in the workshop in terms of how the mobility packages might go, because there's the two camps in terms of whether they'll be bundled or whether they'll be pay-as-you-go, I think is the alternative. So there's a lot of literature in bundling, and we can see bundling take place in a lot of other markets. In telecommunications, for instance, you virtually can't get unbundled services anymore. They bundle together your calls, your text, your internet usage, your home phone or other internet things. So there's certainly a lot of impetus, I think, for the mobility supplier to choose the bundling route, because they have a lot more to gain from it. Because when you bundle, I think one of the drivers is that you don't expect the customer to use up all their entitlements. Of course, they can roll over or otherwise, but then they might not as well. So I think we're not sure how it will play out. But in terms of the present different MaaS kind of offerings around the MaaS Global case is they're bundled. Some of the others are not. I don't know what MaaS Australia said yesterday about their proposed pricing strategy. So there's competing views on that question, but it's a good point.
Thanks, Yale. I think probably important to say as well, one of the outcomes of our discussions around this at Threadbow was that the subscription is probably an ideal end state rather than a start state of how these services might go in our jurisdictions. Look, I think in the